All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Today, we're going to be kind of shifting our focus in our population unit from looking at natural populations to looking at human populations. So up to this point, we've talked about different ways that natural populations grow, different reproductive strategies they have, like R and K selected and type 1, type 2, type 3 survivorship curves. We've also looked at how these populations essentially approach their carrying capacity, how they stay there, and different factors that affect population size. Now, when we talk about humans, it's going to be slightly different, right? Because we live in modern civilizations that have very different needs and requirements than natural populations do. And the way we measure human populations is going to be very different as well. Now, the main way we measure human populations is going to be total fertility rate. And this is usually abbreviated as TFR, is how you'll see it. But all TFR is the average number of children that is born to a woman in the country. Okay. Now, if you think, very quickly, you might be able to realize that if every woman has 2 children, well, that should be about replacement level for a population, because you have 1 for every woman and then 1 for every man. So typically, and we'll talk about this more in the next topic, when you're above 2, your population is growing. When you're below 2, your population is shrinking. So for example, if we look at the graph to the right here, we can see a country like Afghanistan. Each woman on average will have 6 kids. So this is a rapidly growing population. While we look at a country like Germany, each woman will have about 1.4 kids. So this is a population that is rapidly shrinking. The lowest TFR that I know of in the world, I think, is in South Korea. Their TFR is only about 0.9, and they're seeing a rapid decrease in their population over time. Now, what affects your fertility rate? Well, this is going to be a lot of different factors in your civilization, most important of which is going to be how women are treated in the society within that country. So here's a couple. Highly recommend you learn 3 or 4 very in depth because they typically ask you to list some of these in FRQs. But we'll go over all of these right now in detail. So first, prevalence of child labor. If child labor is legal and you have a very agricultural-based society, every child you have is an extra pair of hands bringing in money and food for the household. So typically, poorer countries and developing countries are going to have more children to increase child labor. Next one is cost in raising education of the youth. It's much more expensive now to have a kid than it was in the past, especially when you consider things like college and sports, clothing, all of those things, and all the new demands of modern society. Every year that becomes more and more expensive. So raising youth is a lot more expensive than it used to be, and a lot of families can't afford it, so they choose not to have children. Things like pension programs have gone away. So a lot of parents can't essentially plan for the future because they don't really have a retirement. So having kids is not really an option. Urbanization, there's less room, less space. Things are more expensive in urban areas, so people tend to have less kids. Education and employment opportunities available for women. This is the biggest one that's going to affect your TFR. Essentially, when women are given opportunities within their society, they can focus more on having a career and building their own independent life instead of focusing on just being a child rearer. Next, we have average age at marriage. So as countries become more developed, typically marriage is pushed back later and later in life. People used to get married in their teens or early 20s, but today most people get married in their late 20s or early 30s. So the average age of marriage, and the reason this matters is because typically people have children when they are married. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule, but that's just typical. And the last one is religious beliefs, traditions, and cultural norms. So there are some religions that don't believe in using contraceptives, or they believe in having as many children as possible. Same with certain cultural norms and things like that. In some countries, having access to family planning is looked down on. Places like Poland, they're very strict about things like Planned Parenthood and being able to have access to things like birth control and abortions and things like that. So, what your country allows and doesn't allow for family planning will be a big factor as well. The next important one that we need to talk about is infant mortality rate. Infant mortality rate is going to have a big determining factor on how fast your population grows. Back in the day, when humans, were first starting to settle, create cities and things like that, population growth was still very slow. And a big reason for that is because a lot of offspring died very young, either due to disease or unsanitary drinking water or not having enough food or nutrients. So they had a very high infant mortality rate. If you're not aware of what infant mortality rate is, it's just the percentage of infants that die before the age of 1. And this is largely going to be linked to things like sanitary water, healthcare, and nutrition for both the child and the mother. Typically, more developed nations, like in Europe, are going to have a lower infant mortality rate, which actually does help population growth. But then you also have countries like here, where infant mortality rate is very high, and that can typically diminish growth. Now, there are other factors like we talked about here, which is going to have a bigger impact on your population growth, but infant mortality plays a role as well. And one of the things that we use to determine if a country is developed or developing is what is your current infant mortality rate. Now, we typically measure infant mortality rate in the number of infants that die before 1 over 1,000. So it's not a percent because we're not doing over 100, but it is similar because we're doing it out of 1,000. CBR and DBR, which is child birth rate and death rate, is also measured in the same way. Now, when we look at populations growing and changing over time, we use something called an age structure diagram. And essentially what this shows is what is the age makeup of your population. So in a country that is rapidly growing, you're typically going to have a lot of young people, and then the generations before them will be incredibly small compared to the ones below them. And this makes sense, right? You're actively reproducing, your population is growing, so most of your civilization should be young. So what we see here is a triangle-shaped age structure diagram in which most people are young and few people are old. In a slowly growing population, you still have this triangle, but the difference between the young population and the old population in terms of size is much more subtle. So you're still growing, but it's not nearly as dramatic as it was here. Next, you have stable. In stable population, essentially you're not growing or shrinking. Your population is maintaining relatively the same size. So you can see this young generation is about equal with the older one. It kind of makes this half oval that you see here. Typically in these countries, you're looking at a TFR of about 2, like we talked about up here, how you would need a TFR of 2 in order to kind of replace your population. The fast-growing nations that are growing really quickly, they would have very high TFRs. So that would be countries that are located up here. And then the last one, which is more of a modern issue, is a shrinking population in which the new generation of infants that are born are smaller in terms of population size than the generations before them. So once your TFR starts getting below that 2, you're going to start seeing a shrinking population. And there are lots of countries, modern countries, that are struggling with this right now. You can see them all here. Now, I know you might be thinking, how does the United States have a TFR of 1.8, but it's still growing every year? Well, that's due to immigration, right? The people are immigrating to the United States. So technically, our population is still growing, but it is not due to how much births are occurring. All right, and that will bring us to our FRQ, which is on an age structure diagram. So we have an age structure diagram of Japan here in 2020. You can see the different age makeups over here and what percentage of the population they make up down here. So it says, a researcher says that Japan has a shrinking population. Support this claim using the figures. Make sure you use some data. Talk about some of the trends that we talked about here. And then number 2 says, predict if Japan has a low or high TFR. So use some of that TFR information we talked about over here and predict if Japan is high or low relative to replacement, which is 2. So that's going to be it for today. Don't forget we have a quiz tomorrow, and I will see you then.